My co-presenter, Dr. Pilani Zamchia from the University of the Western Cape, has unfortunately fallen ill and is unable to join us today, but we will go ahead with this masterclass. I'm really happy to see all the participants today, and I'm looking forward to a very engaging discussion on this topic on the gendered implications of formalization of customary land in Africa. I hope so far we are enjoying the sessions in the conference this year. So to get us started, I will go through the outline of the masterclass. So we'll start off with just brief introductions, and I will give an overview of the privatization and formalization of customary land in Africa. And then I will invite everyone to just share their experiences on the privatization and formalization of customary land from either their work or their experiences in the various countries they live and work. And then I will give an overview of the regional perspective on women's land tenure security in Southern Africa, giving case studies from 4 countries that we're working in. And then again, I will invite all participants to give us reflections on what they think are the policy entry points for protecting women's land rights in the face of the formalization processes that are being undertaken across the continent. Then I will come back and make a presentation on what we think are the entry points to protecting women's livelihoods and land rights across the continent. We'll close it off with a discussion and conclude the session. We have an hour to get through all of this. So I invite you to please engage with me and engage with one another as we go on with the discussion. So as a brief introduction, what we want to do in this masterclass is basically to share lessons on the character of the evolving land tenure regimes that we're seeing across the continent. We're seeing some changes and also continuities in the greater impact on how women as well as men relate to the formalization of land rights. So this, we look at it from the adaptations from below. So we're seeing a very localized change in various countries in Southern Africa and in other parts of Africa as well. But then there's also a global context that we see from above, being led obviously by international non-governmental organizations, coming from the face of the resurgence of the pro-market land policies that are leading the privatization and formalization of land rights. So we see that these changes have created a new gendered land tenure regime in sub-Saharan Africa, but it remains different from what we normally would term the Western legal forms of private property. And as a result, what we start seeing is that there's a new challenge to academic as well as policy responses. So how then can we address this, taking into account all the changes and the dynamics that are going on in this space? So in this masterclass, we'll want to generate debate on the driving factors to this formalization and privatization, the outcomes. We also want to look at the nature of the obtaining tenure as it relates to the protection of women's interests in land, the land uses and livelihoods. But also the idea of this masterclass is to be not very theoretical. So we want to be as practical as possible. So we want to ensure that rural women, policymaker donors, and civil society organizations in Africa are supported with empirical evidence and advocacy options that they will need to promote policy formulation and also implementation of these policies based on the local practices and livelihoods, and ensure that we capture the context of land tenure reform and also the livelihoods of women in rural areas. To give an overview of the privatization and formalization of customary land in Africa, we see over the last couple of decades that there has been a rapid drive towards the formalization of rights in land for people who live under customary tenure. We actually see from the literature that about 90% of land in this region, the sub-Saharan African region that is held under customary tenure. And a number of African governments, civil society organizations, and some African feminist lawyers as well as Western donors, have argued that there's so many benefits to land rights, one of which is improving tenure security. And as compared to the tenure system that allow for formal surveying of boundaries, the registration and documentation of land in the form of certification, state leaseholds, or title deeds. And further in the literature, we see that between 1990 and 2017, when you look at how many land laws have been enacted, 32 in sub-Saharan Africa have focused on formalizing rights on customary land. And the arguments are quite varied. Why do we need to formalize customary land? So the proponents of the formalization processes argue that individuals, including women, can acquire land in their own names and improve their tenure security. Perhaps one of the most forwarded arguments for the formalization of customary land. And also there's a creation of land markets, they argue, which will replace or has replaced formal markets that transfer land to efficient agrarian users. So the idea that when you transfer land to those who are able and willing to use the land for productive purposes, it leads to greater investment. Another argument is that formal land rights holders can use the land as collateral to borrow money from banks and other financial institutions, again increasing their investment in land as a result of this opened up capital access, if you will. And also another argument is that the formalization will replace patriarchal customary land governance systems and emancipate women as a result. We'll see as we go ahead in this session what our experiences and have been from the field. And also another argument is that the formalization will reduce land conflicts. And then finally, there's an argument for increased responsible investments in land and the protection of communities' land rights. So those are the arguments around the formalization of customary land. But when we look at all of this, one question that is not critically considered is how this formalization is really affecting tenure security for rural women and what implications it has for policymakers. How can we provide evidence to policymakers to ensure that when they enact or when they develop policies, they take into account the changing dynamic around tenure security with the coming in of formalization or privatization of land? And when we look at the Prindex survey, okay, sorry, if we can please unmute, mute ourselves. I think I can hear someone in the background. Thank you. Okay, so in terms of the protection of women's land rights and tenure security from the formalization process, the recent Prindex survey shows that in sub-Saharan Africa, nearly 50% of women still fear losing their land in the event of divorce or death of a spouse. So we see that there is still some precarity when it comes to women's land rights, even with the formalization process having taken full effect in some countries on the continent. So given this contested nature of the outcomes, the benefits that are being argued by formalists, and also evidence from the ground that is showing that the formalization processes may not actually be leading to this tenure security that is being promoted. What then we want to do in this masterclass is to enrich the debate beyond statistical surveys and desktop analysis and also ideological persuasions. What we want to do is to give solid ethnographic case studies from Mozambique, Zambia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, where we have undertaken research on the formalization process and its implications on women's tenure security and livelihoods. So that's basically the background. So this research is being undertaken by the Institute for Poverty and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape, supported by the Austrian Development Agency. And the research, as I have mentioned, focuses on the privatization of customary land and implications for women's land tenure security and livelihoods in Southern Africa in the 4 countries. We started this project last year in June 2020. Our first phase was a qualitative research that was undertaken in 2020 and in the first quarter of 2021. And I will present some preliminary results from this first phase. And we're currently undertaking phase 2 in the 4 countries. This is a more quantitative approach. And so we are conducting household surveys to provide more information and more data from the qualitative study that we undertook earlier. Before I go on, I would like to just invite participants to just share their experiences and reflections on the privatization and formalization of customary land from your own experience, either from your work or from the countries where you live. We have about 5 minutes perhaps to just do this. So I'd like to invite everyone, whoever has a comment, to please unmute yourself and just give us a 1 minute or so reflection or sharing of your experience on the privatization and formalization of customary land before I then come in to give our results and experiences from the 4 countries. I see we have over 20 participants, so please feel free to just unmute yourself so that we can engage in discussions. Is there anyone that wants to go? Maria, I see you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Mariamarissa. I'm working with the African Development Bank as a land specialist. And I just wanted to either contribute a little bit on the argument which you have presented. You mentioned some of the areas whereby by providing or by formalizing the customary land for women, there are some benefits which are coming in hand with that. But I also wanted to add an area of sustainable management of land, which results into, which is a result of securing land rights to women. Now, this is an area whereby we don't really very much touch when we talk about women's land rights. And we know that the majority of women are operating in the rural areas. And these are the areas whereby they depend more on agriculture. And with the current climate change, there is a need to, or maybe I would not say there is a need, but I would just say that there is that relationship between security of tenure and management of the land they use. Because we know that the land keeps on, we keep on losing land due to the effects of climate change. And we really need the ones who are using the land to take responsibility in managing that land and protect. So we have several ways of doing that, including sustainable land management approaches and so forth. And I think one of the arguments which we can add is by giving them certainty of the future of the land they have, they will contribute in making sure that we protect the land we have, which is finite. We cannot add with the land we have. That's only one area which I wanted to contribute on. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria. Yes, a very important point that you raise, the sustainable management of land. How do you ensure that as we carry out these formalization processes, because the idea is that customary land is being lost to leasehold tenure, for example, or state land in some cases, but how do we ensure that in all of these processes, sustainable management of land is upheld? And also, within customary land rights, how do we ensure that we protect forests, for example? We ensure that sustainable agriculture practices are being promoted. Can we develop policies that will ensure that we do not waste land any more than it has in the face of climate change, as you have mentioned, Maria. And it's very important and interesting that right now we have COP26 going on. So can we then bring in customary land formalization processes and marry that with climate change discussions and ensure that we are protecting both the climate, but we are also protecting land as well. And at the same time, not leaving women in more precarious conditions than they were before the formalization of their customary land rights. Thanks a lot, Maria, for that intervention and for your contribution as well. Is there anyone else that would like to come in before then we move on to the next session of the masterclass?
Yeah, I would.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was just thinking about maybe not from my work, but just the whole process of formalization and privatization of customary land. To say it's also very important to look at from which angle is it coming from? Who demands the formalization and privatization of land? Because that's very important. Because I'm looking at the process itself of formalizing customary land. If we go to issues of maybe making title deeds, actually favors more men than women because of their position. So I think it's I don't know what your study comes up with, but from what I experience in terms of as the land is becoming more formalized, you see more men taking up maybe even ownership compared to women because of the process that the formalization in itself women have to go through. They don't, maybe issues of levels of education and all that they can't even read the deeds. Yes, the process is just as much complicated as it for women who are already burdened with a number of issues, and then they are disadvantaged already. So it's very important to look at who is demanding this formalization. Is it from above, or maybe the policymakers, or it's from below the women farmers, because that's very crucial in how do they go about it. Thank you.
Absolutely right, Loveness. I'm glad that you brought that up. Actually, we do see this happening quite a bit, as I will share from our research in Mozambique and Zambia, where we see quite an upsurge in the formalization process. We do see that the experience is different in the two countries. In Mozambique, you see more of formalization from above, and then we start seeing what impact that has on the women who is taking up land. And like you rightly put it, those who have access to information, knowledge, and economic resources tend to be the ones that will take up this land, will acquire the certificates or documentation that are being introduced. And then in Zambia, you would argue it's formalization from below. This is being driven by civil society organizations. But then at the same time, you want to see how exactly is this impacting the women. And even if it's formalization from below, it is civil society organizations that are driving it. So are we then arguing that they protect the interests of the women, or whose interests are they protecting? Even if it's from below, we're taking it for granted that women are actively participating. There is that contestation of who civil society represents, if it's the locals, if it's in this case, the rural women, or are they basically protecting their own interest and mandate? I think that is a very important point for interrogation. Lastly, I think I will ask Innocent to just come in and give us his reflections before then I move on with the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really happy. My name is Innocent Antoine Weji. I'm the Executive Director of Youth Initiative for Land in Africa. So we are working with youths and defending the youth rights as far as the land is concerned. So quickly, my reflection. We have two actors we need to consider when we are talking about the customary land. The first is youth. Even if we talk about women, we have the young women, so we have it. So we need to involve youth, and we need to involve the traditional authorities is really important. So if we want to do, we want to have a privatization and formalization of customary land, even if the states, even if the government is there, we need to have the multi stakeholders platform who will involve the two actors, who is really important to make an effort to protect the women land right, because no women, no food in Africa. So we need to consider the two actors really. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Innocent. And yes, you're absolutely right. Youth are a very important player in the protection of land rights. And if their rights are not protected, then of course the policies then will not be effective when it comes to implementation. And at the same time, we need to ensure that traditional leaders, as you've said, they need to recognize the importance of protecting not only women's land rights, but youth land rights as well. So they need to be supported. They need to participate in policy formulation processes as well. So that's also a very important point that you've raised. Very happy with your contributions, Maria, Innocent. And so I will move on now to the next part of the presentation, which is where I'm basically going to look at give a regional perspective on women's land tenure security in Southern Africa. And this is based on the research that we've undertaken in the 4 countries, as I've mentioned. And some of the things that you will see me present touch on some of the interventions that we've heard from our participants today. So the outline in this section is basically the nature and drivers of the formalization of land in sub-Saharan Africa. And I will also look at the mainstream development narratives and try to counter that against the emerging narratives from the field as we undertook our fieldwork. And then the impact of state-driven urbanization versus elite-driven urbanization as we see it in 2-country case studies. And then we'll look at women's perspectives on traditional leaders across the region. I'm glad that Innocent raised the important role that traditional leaders play. And then finally, what are the women themselves saying in terms of policy? What do they prefer and what do they want to see? So let me go straight into the drivers and nature of formalization in the 4 countries. So in Mozambique, we have a process that is promoting the formalization of customary land. So this is legislated process. So we see the production of a DUAT, which is a document that shows ownership of customary land. And this is being driven from above, as I mentioned earlier, so by the state. But then we also see that the World Bank is supporting this initiative, and they donated in 2018, $100 million towards this project. And the target is 45% of the 157 districts in Mozambique. And then in Zambia, the formalization process is unlegislated. So we see the production of customary land holding certificates. This is being driven from below by civil society organizations, but they have a lot of donor support. But as we go on and look at this project, we see that in some cases, these funds are dwindling. So then we start to think about the sustainability of the project and the transfer of skills and ensuring that the processes continue. But also we need to interrogate what are the benefits of these processes if they are to continue. And in South Africa, the formalization process, you would argue, comes from a movement from the urban elites. So those who are moving from urban areas back into the rural areas on customary land because they want to avoid paying rates, and also are seeking cheaper retirement homes. So what we start seeing is that they start taking up plots on customary land, and therefore, because they have more economic power, they're able to push out the rural poor who've lived on this land for much longer. And then in Zimbabwe, it's a much more different situation that's going on. So we see the local state's appropriation of communal land for urban development. So what the local authority in Zimbabwe is doing is that they're basically just dusting off colonial master plans from the 1950s, the master plans that were dominated by a period of high modern ideologies that really did not capture the lived realities in Zimbabwe. So those are the factors that are driving formalization in the 4 countries. And so just to share some pictures of the research that we undertook, our field work in Mozambique. Yes. So these are the women just saying they want their rights protected. And then here in Zambia, we see a customary landholding certificate. So this is issued by a traditional leader. So as we see, this is a Nyimba district in the eastern province of Zambia. So Chief Ndake is issuing this customary landholding certificates. And so we see an engagement and involvement of the local traditional leadership in the formalization process. And then a very interesting picture here, as you can see, this is in Zambia again. So we have this customary land where the locals meet. This is a church. The building that you see there is a church. And on the left-hand side is a mining company that has been given a license to start mining granite. And so you start seeing that there is a threat. So the formalization is the mining company has acquired rights from the traditional leader, but you can see just how close it is to the locals' homes and also places of worship. And then in South Africa, we see this is customary land, so not very close, but you can see that they're building mansions basically. So these are not shacks. These are not small houses. These are mansions that are being built by those who have returned from the urban area and want to retire on customary land. So you see that there is that economic power that is threatening ownership on customary land. And then in Zimbabwe here, these are the locals have been displaced, and so they're setting up new homes in a rural area in Zimbabwe. But then what I want to move on to now is just to compare the countries, because as we've seen in Mozambique, we have the DUAT, which is a document that is issued by the state. And in Zambia, we have customary landholding certificates that are issued by civil society organizations and traditional leaders with support from donors. So what I'm going to do is just going to show comparative aspects between Zambia and Mozambique. And what we see in both countries that we have flanking mechanisms that are going on. So these are programs that advocate for the registration of customary land rights. So let's see what exactly this means in the 2 countries. So in contesting the narratives when it comes to what is going on in the literature and debates around development of customary land, the mainstream development assumption is that the evolution of land rights towards individualization which will lead to titling, will obviously improve investment. But then when we look at Mozambique, we see that neither the Western form of titling nor the ideal customary tenure exists. The idea of sharing land is still very strong in Mozambique. So the individualization of tenure that is being argued for, we don't see much of it in Mozambique. And in Zambia, a similar case is seen where there is neither the Western form of titling nor the ideal customary tenure. So sustainability is already in question here, like I mentioned earlier, due to funding. So the idea of sharing land is still very strong. Common land is still very strong, where livestock is able to is being taken to graze, where rural women or rural communities are able to cut firewood, for example. We see that this is still very strong, and it does not take the Western idea of the individualization of tenure. And then another argument in the development circles is that the protection of property rights for vulnerable women will come as a result of this formalization of tenure. In Mozambique, we do see that women, particularly widows, are benefiting, but there is a discrepancy when it comes to divorced women, because they don't have access to resources and information, and so they are excluded from the formalization process. And in Zambia, we see that the formalization process is mainly benefiting married women, but again, those who are informed and privileged. So access to information is very important when it comes to the formalization process. Another argument is that improved investment and agriculture productivity will come as a result of the formalization process. But in both countries, we do not see any correlation with increased crop and livestock production. Actually, you will see that some arguments for formalization in Zambia show that when you have a customary land holding certificate, you will have access to more farming inputs, for example, but we do not see that happening on the ground from our research. And so going on to the narrative, still continuing, there's another argument around gender neutral and efficient land markets. But in Mozambique, what we see is that, yes, there is a rising informal land market, but the land prices tend to exclude poor women. And then in Zambia, we see the same thing, rising informal land markets and land prices, but we have local elites participating more in the market and acquiring land for speculative purposes. Another argument for the formalization of customary land is the reduction of land conflicts. In Mozambique, there's a widening discontent over the exclusion of common property resources in registration. So DUATs in Mozambique are being issued on residential land, but when it comes to common property resources, we don't see this happening. But there is a threat over the locals not being able to have access to common property resources in the long run, because DUAs are now being issued to private companies. And then in Zambia, there is a reduction in conflict over boundaries. This was quite evident. And this is one of the main drivers of the formalization of customary land, because there is a reduction in conflict over boundaries. However, there is still conflict with returnees, those who are coming back to the rural area after being away for a number of years. Another argument is improved land governance. So new patriarchal and authoritarian systems are replacing traditional leaders in Mozambique. And in Zambia, we do see that there's a new gender inclusive and more participatory system of land governance. Okay, so those are some of our findings from Zambia and Mozambique. So looking at the two based on their experiences of the formalization process. And now just to quickly move on to Zimbabwe and South Africa, where formalization or urbanization is being led by, I would say, different groups. So we see a state-driven urbanization in Zimbabwe, and then an elite-driven urbanization in South Africa. So what we see in this comparison is that there's certain fundamental differences depending on who is driving the urbanization and formalization in this case. So in Zimbabwe, the beneficiaries are usually the locally employed, the urban elites, who are based as far as the capital city, Harare, migrants who worked in South Africa and now have returned, and also the local big shot of the ruling party. And in South Africa, the beneficiaries are mainly the urban elites who are employed in Polokwane and retired civil servants, as we saw in the picture that I shared earlier, those who are building these big houses in the rural areas. But in both countries, we see that there's an increased legibility of customary land to the markets. But when it comes to homelessness, we see that in Zimbabwe, there is an increased rate of homelessness by the vulnerable and poor women due to failure to pay council lease and rentals. They're constantly being threatened with eviction because they have not paid their rentals, they have not paid the council leases, and they're in arrears. And in South Africa, the urban elites are moving onto rural land or customary land because they don't have to pay the rates to municipalities. So there is no increased rate of homelessness. They actually are what we would call off-grid because they don't have to pay those rates. Then in both countries, there's a miniaturization of farms. So with the scarcity of land in both countries, small farms are now emerging. They're occupying less land, but accommodating more people. So we see that farms are becoming smaller and smaller due to this urbanization that is being driven either by the urban elite or by the local state. Okay, and then in Zimbabwe, in terms of land sales, we see that there is an increase in land sales as well as rentals in adjacent communal areas, but these are unaffordable to the vulnerable women. So they involve individual transactions, and they're actually mediated by the village head. And we contrast that with South Africa, where yes, there are increasing land sales, they're unaffordable to the vulnerable women, but the traditional leaders are actually the ones who are selling land due to the high demand. So in South Africa, you actually see the use of violence being quite prevalent in acquiring land for either speculative purposes or for the land to be sold off to urban elites. And then in Zimbabwe and South Africa, we see that there is a loss of common property resources for grazing, livestock, collecting firewood, and other natural resources. And also in both countries, we see the loss of incorporeal rights, possessions, the intangible spiritual capital that we rarely talk about when we talk about formalization processes. And even in large-scale land-based acquisitions, we rarely talk about this, but we see a loss of these rights in both countries. In Zimbabwe, state security, that is the police and army, are driving violence against the women who are resisting. So there is actually an active presence of police and the army in this process in Zimbabwe. And in South Africa, we see the involvement of traditional leaders using violence to drive women away. Women who are resisting are being exposed to a lot of violence, being exposed to their land being taken away from them by the traditional leaders in South Africa. This is just an example in Zimbabwe of a demand letter that was sent to a woman because she had accumulated arrears over her land. So these are lease fees that she has not paid over her customary land. And so her house here was reduced to a rubble by the police. And then these are women who are considered surplus population because they're old, because they're disabled. So vulnerable women are at risk, most especially in Zimbabwe. And then I will quickly look at the women's views on traditional leaders because they are important stakeholders when it comes to the formalization processes and how they respond and also protect women's land rights. In Zambia, we see that most women see traditional leaders as gender inclusive, democratic, and accountable as well. So women have established a working alliance with traditional leaders to defend women's land rights. But what we see is that there is a certain category of women who are disgruntled, and these are single women without children. They don't tend to have the same rights to land as married women, as divorced women with children, or widowed women with children. And in Zimbabwe, what we see is that most women have made alliances with the traditional leaders to defend their land. So traditional leaders are not seen as democratic as in Zambia, but they are viewed as better than elected councillors who are seen as corrupt and driving utopian development ideas. But what we see in Zimbabwe, that again, there's a category of women who are disgruntled. These are widows without children, single ladies, single women without children, and those who are divorced for quote unquote witchcraft and prostitution. And then in South Africa, most women view the traditional leaders as corrupt and accountable and patriarchal. So they prefer to opt out and choose their own traditional leader. So a very interesting dynamic here in South Africa, where women can choose to leave a particular traditional leader, not be under their custody, and move to another traditional leader, if you will. And then in Mozambique, traditional leaders tend to play a very ceremonial role. So they're not directly involved in local land administration. What we have in Mozambique are local committees who are dominated by ruling Frelimo and are seen as patriarchal, and the disgruntled here tend to mostly be married women. So when we speak to the women about what do they want to see in terms of policy interventions over customary land, what we hear is that the majority of women land rights holders across the 4 countries prefer to live under customary systems compared to individual titling. And even women who prefer certification of residential, arable, and common property resources still want this to be under customary tenure systems. And this contradicts the evolutionary theory of land rights and some African feminist lawyers who are advocating for individual titling as a solution to insecure land tenure for women. And the major reasons were that customary land is cheaper, as people did not have to pay rates, and it's supported by a diverse range of land-based livelihoods for the poor and vulnerable. Most women also prefer the negotiability, flexibility, and adaptability of existing customary arrangements, which work well for the poor and future generations. And the traditional leaders also do not want the conversion of customary tenure to individual titling to retain authority and power over land. And so, as I've mentioned already, there is this unusual alliance between the women and traditional leaders, and we don't see that much in the literature. But this doesn't mean that women want to continue living under patriarchal norms. They still are resisting the patriarchy, and the practices are being reformed. The customary practices that work against women and their access to land are being reformed. Women are working closely with traditional leaders and local representatives as well. Now, having just looked at some of our experiences and findings from the field, we need to now consider the entry points for protecting women's livelihoods in the face of customary land privatization. How exactly do we ensure that women's land rights are protected, even as we move forward with the privatization or formalization of customary land? And so, before I move on to that, what I want to do is open this up. I know we have a couple of minutes remaining for us to have a discussion. So I want to open this up. How do we ensure that we protect women's livelihoods in the face of customary land privatization? Not only from the 4 countries that I've presented, but generally on the African continent. How do we ensure that women's livelihoods are still protected, whether we are formalizing customary land, or we're privatizing it, or how do we transform the land tenure system to ensure that women do not lose out in the end? Again, I will open this up. Raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can continue with the discussion. If anyone is ready to go, I see there are some comments in the chat. I'll just get to them now, but please feel free to unmute yourself and share your views and experiences. What are the entry points for protecting women's land rights? Stella, you can go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to bring the experience of Uganda, where women are being included in what we call the customary certificates. There is a law now that when there are certificates on customary land that are issued to families, women's names should be there, and then this one secures their livelihoods because they can continue using their land without fear of being evicted. So when women's names are included in these customary certificates, we see that it protects them rather than if you just leave women to continue under the patriarchal situation where, you know, they're under the traditional chiefs. I think this is one way where women's livelihoods can continue to be secure. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Yes, absolutely right. Anyone else want to go? Very interesting experience there shared by Stella in Uganda. Okay, before we lose any more time, what I want to do is I want to go on and just look at the entry points for protecting women's livelihoods in the face of customary land privatization. And so some of the recommendations are that women, especially rural women, must participate in land policy formulation at all levels. So in consultative processes, Mozambique is currently reviewing its land policy. Zambia recently approved its land policy. So in all processes of consultation, in all processes of the land policy formulation, we need to ensure that women and rural women are represented. Women's groups should have their voices heard when it comes to the formulation of land policies. And also, land policies need to be based on the principle of gender equality, the idea that there is equal access to resources needs to be emphasized in land policies. One of the things that we find that is that some policies may be well formulated, but implementation is another issue. So in as much as we're developing policies that promote gender equality, even in implementation, we need to ensure that these principles are adhered to and advocated for. And this is important for civil society organizations and other players in the policy, on the policy front. Another recommendation is that we need to ensure that data on land rights are sex disaggregated. Access to data and statistics may be a challenge in a lot of countries, but as we're continuing to collect more data, as we're continuing to ensure that we're making this data accessible across the continent, we need to be very careful about how we collect that data and how we categorize the data as well, and use that data to inform our policy formulation processes. Another entry point is guaranteeing the application of the free, prior, and informed consent principle. So the ability for women, and in this case, we can also talk about local rural communities, having the ability to say yes or no to development projects and having their voices heard. So situations where we have civil society organizations advocating and working together with rural women and also supporting traditional leaders to ensure that they give informed consent when it comes to development projects in their localities. Another entry point is the female local leaders, gender experts, and civil society must participate in policy formulation and legislation reviews. This obviously needs to speak to all legislation reviews and policy formulation processes, not only those that speak specifically to gender, but any constitutional review processes needs to be to have representation of female local leaders, gender experts, and civil society organizations. And what we need to ensure here is that there is a harmonization of policies as well as legislation to ensure that there are no discrepancies, and we ensure that there is harmonization of all of these policies and laws. Another entry point is a support of champions of women's land rights. So we do see from our research that traditional leaders and some religious leaders have been participating actively in policy formulation processes. They've participated in negotiating for women when it comes to displacement and resettlement. And so we need to ensure that those champions are supported financially, supported in terms of institutional capacity for traditional leaders, so that they can continue to advocate for women's land rights, and also ensure that these traditional leaders and religious leaders are also women. Another entry point is to ensure that any dispute resolution mechanisms are gender sensitive. We can do this by encouraging the participation of women in these dispute resolution committees. There are land allocation committees that are present in a few countries across the continent. So the representation of women on these committees is very important to ensure that women's land rights are protected. And also supporting women's access to information and resources on land rights in the appropriate language. We have policies, documents, communiques, and so many documents that are produced by various organizations, international academic institutions as well, that speak to women's land rights. But they remain inaccessible because they're in a language that women cannot access. So they cannot read those documents. So ensuring that these resources are available to women in a language they can understand is important. And also developing tools to address household power relations. So we do see that formalization processes sometimes may tilt the power relations in a household. And what does that mean for women? So we see sometimes that there is a threat for gender-based violence or violence being heightened as a result of a formalization process, particularly in situations where a married woman acquires a certificate in her name. That might put her in a vulnerable situation. So we need to ensure that tools are developed to address any household power relations that may arise as a result of the formalization process. And then finally, the creation of mechanisms to monitor policy implementation. Various policies have been developed at national, regional, and continental level. But when it comes to implementation, sometimes that is lacking. And the reason implementation may be lacking is because we do not adequately monitor it. So it's important that mechanisms are created to make policymakers, implementers of these policies accountable to the policies that they make and implement on the ground. Okay, so we have about 7 minutes to go. I will open this up to discussion. Please feel free once again to just raise your hand, unmute yourself, and give us your experience on the formalization of customary land. It may be related to what I've spoken about in this masterclass, or in relation to any other experience from your work or from your country. Let's close this off with this discussion in the next couple of minutes. Innocent, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Really happy to your presentation. So I want to add some key points. So the first is the Queen Mothers. You know, in Africa, we have a part of the men who are traditional authorities. We have the Queen Mothers. So I need that you will take a very important point about the Queen Mothers. So take in account. And another thing is what? Yes, sometimes the youth are considered as a vulnerable a target But when we are talking about the private privatization of customary lands, we can take the youth like an opportunity for the community, because when you want to develop the land data, we want to develop the new technology of land cartography and another thing. You know that the youth, the young people have the good knowledge now to develop some application, develop some data issues, some many technology. So it's really important that we will consider the youth as important point, as important opportunity to protect the livelihood of the women as far as the privatization of customary land is concerned. So it's really important. I want to take point out of this and let you know that you will take account in your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Innocent. Yes, again, emphasizing the role of youth in protecting land rights and ensuring that there is tenure security, not only for women, but like you said, for youth as well. And one thing I do want to mention that is that even as we undertook this, our research, we realized that women who are youths also have different experiences when it comes to accessing land. In some countries, young women have a better opportunity or have more advantage with accessing land compared to other countries. But one thing that we did find was important was women with children. So it might be a young woman who is single, and that woman will find it difficult to have access to land. And then you have a young woman who is married, she might have a better chance at having access to land. So those different categories of women were important considerations in the discussion on land, access to land for women and improving their tenure security. But yes, Innocent, I absolutely agree with you that we need to consider youth in the discussion on women's land rights and tenure security in general. Thanks, Innocent. Is there any other question before we close in the next 2 minutes? Okay. Hey, so just to conclude, women's land rights remain very important in the continent and in the consideration of access to land and their livelihood and also economic empowerment. And so as we go ahead with this formalization processes, it is important that we consider what it means for women, what is the implication of the formalization process on women's livelihood. And Loveness has raised a very important question. The last question here is, should formalization of customary land continue? Do the benefits outweigh the challenges? And I think this is something that I want to leave with everyone as we wrap up this discussion. Should we continue with the formalization of women's land rights, or should we start considering tenure security on customary land in and of itself, away from the formalization processes? And also away from the Western idea of titling. I know this is a discussion that I've seen in the chat as well. The Western idea of titling, or the modernization of land rights, is it something that we should be considering, or should we be thinking about other ways of protecting women's land rights within the context of the customary areas that we work? Thank you very much for your participation in this masterclass. And I will point you to some further reading, so some resources there. So PLAS has some policy declarations that we've put together with the civil society organizations that we've worked with in the 4 countries, and also with traditional leaders and women themselves. So we have those policy declarations that you can have access to, and also training manuals on women's land rights. You can find those on the PLAS website. So those links shared there, and then some further reading on women's land rights, particularly speaking to the formalization process. Thank you so much for your participation in this masterclass, and I look forward to interacting with you during the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.